Hello and welcome back. Our third and final session for the day is a panel titled Art in the Age of Migration, Ecology and Environment. And it's a pleasure to welcome Tayeba Begum Lipi, artist, co-founder and trustee of Britto ArtsTrust, Heather Igloliorte, University Research Chair in CircumpolarIndigenous Arts, Concordia University, Sonal, Khullar, NormanBrown Associate Professor of South Asian Studies, University of Pennsylvania, and Charlene Villaseñor Black, Professor of Art History and Chicana Studies, UCLA. This session is moderated by Terri Geis, Visiting Associate Professor of Art and Art History, NYU Abu Dhabi. Each panelist will present first, followed by a moderated discussion and an audience Q&A. I'd now like to welcome Tayeba.
I always say that I hate to be the first one. And also, I can see you because it's a reading class. I have to read from my phone. I'm very unprofessional, not bringing my paper. Anyway, I'll go for the, some historical background of Bangladesh. So this is Bangladeshi map, a densely populated country with over 160 million people. Bangladesh faces numerous cultural, economic, social, and environmental challenges, including political instability that you all know. Bangladesh is bordered by India to the east, west, and north, and to the southeast by Myanmar and the Bay of Bengal. The country has two geographically distinctive features: the vast low-lying Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta. Where is this one? And the hilly Madhpur and Barind uplands that traverse it. Owing to the geography, much of the country is flooded annually by melted ice from the Himalayas, which is like, in combination with other natural disasters, create cyclical waves of displacement, wherein migrants in many parts of the country must relocate in search of new means of subsistence. The vast Bangladesh-India border that divides the Ganges Delta region from the Sundarban mangrove forest is enforced by a giant barbed wire fence installed by the Indian government. We don't have money to install that one, so maybe if we have money, Bangladesh government will do the same. This fence interrupts the natural flow of mountain water and the movement of humans and wildlife, animals, plants, and people that belong to one interdependent community are forcibly separated by a spatial logic that predominantly directs the vulnerabilities and burdens the border creates onto the smaller and more economically disadvantaged Bangladesh. So as an individual practitioner, I actually am a multidisciplinary artist, so doing like a lot of things at the same time, and then which is always addressing my private life and public life with the domestic objects to social elements. I didn't have to go through the historically remarkable multiple shifting in life, perhaps, and there was no forced migration implemented in my own life. But as a child who was born in late 60s, I did experience the after effects of the political and social changes occurred in my part of the world. I saw the fear, sadness, challenges amongst families, friends, and neighbors that were either unwillingly or forcefully separated from each other. We all know the history. Being together as a subcontinent with a huge land of 1.7 million square miles is a hallucination for many from this century. The innocent inhabitants from all three parts, now Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, with various beliefs and perspectives, used to live together happily in one large land earlier, which is like a dream now. When some regions of globe are trying to be reunited to see themselves as a new community, as a deepest pain and frustration, we experience the opposite policies by the authorities of the parted countries. In past, we eventually choose a partition that did not bring any happiness to those who were forced to be unrooted within a night. So in response to this, in 2013, I did a small project titled like this, which was showing actually the whole Indian subcontinent in one plate. These are like a stainless steel plate. And Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. So we actually, from 1.7 million square mile to we are now 55,598 square mile. So that's what we are now. And there's old-fashioned like spans around frames are made out of stainless steel razor blades. So I will go for another project, which is like, where is this? Okay. This is part of Britto ArtsTrust, which we titled as No Man's Land. And you'll see it was curated by Mahbubur Rahman from Bangladesh and Shayantan Moitra Buka from India, who, and Britto ArtsTrust and Shelter Promotion Council both worked together for this project. It took us actually 4 years to do this project. You can see the, the border, which is, I'm showing it from Bangladesh side. The fence look actually, pretty light, but it's not. It's a thick fence. So this is the situation of the whole space. So the river is also divided. But we still have business that's coming from British India. So India is sending limestone to Bangladesh, and it's a legal business, it's not illegal. So that kind of business is happening. And as a result, we had only one like very small hill there, although like in Indian part, they have this huge Khashi hills. And this was in 2014, but we went back for Documenta project, for the Documenta 15. We went back there and found that this hill is already gone, and it's a huge lake now. So there is this T-pillar. We had two kind of pillars. One is T-pillar and one is S-pillar. And these all still have India Park. And the artist tried to respond to the whole thing. So we placed ourselves in 2 different sides of the borderline. And India had like around 10 artists there, and we were about 15 artists. We were staying in a Manipuri village. And this is like, I have to tell you one thing, that we always, like all these mainstream people, we always talk about ourselves, like we are Bengalis. But there are a lot of indigenous people around the borderline. We never talk about them. So they were also separated by this, no man's land or whatever you said, the international borderline. So we have another project called Prantike Prakritojan, which one, we have been doing it from 2009 and going through all these indigenous communities to just see, how they are living, to respond to their crisis or the kind of politics we are actually, how we are exploiting them, in those areas that we try to figure out. And we translated the whole project in Documenta 15, alongside of all other projects that we did. So there were so many performances that artists did. And our target was to meet with each other at the real no man's land without the passport and visa. So you can imagine how difficult it was for us to get that permission. It was really challenging. So the day we were just planning to, this is from Indian side, the artists were doing work over there. We had binocular, by the way, so we were trying to see each other's work. So it was a long wait. This time we had permission, and our Indian counterpart didn't have any permission. So we were waiting for 7 days to get the permission. And finally we got it. That day we were actually returning home from the place after this open studio, and we said goodbye to each other. Same day, we just got the phone call. When we just turned back, we got the phone call that we got the permission, please come. So they mentioned one gate where we have to meet with each other. So this is the gate pass. And that was the goodbye, actually. We were saying goodbye to each other. They were waiting in that small hut of the border guards. And we were here. And we were all screaming, shouting, and trying to call each other also over the phone. So finally we met. We spent 2.5 hours at the border, at the no man's land. You can see in the middle, between two curators, there is this pillar that is called S pillar. So at the beginning, the Indian border guards said that, just no touching, you go, just go away from each other. But after 2 hours, they came and they said no photographs. Within 2 hours, I think after 1 hour actually, they came to, they were asking us to take photographs with them. So that was fantastic, finally. So this left side is Indian artist and the curator, and the right side is Bangladeshi artist. And there were performances also. And our border guards, we have really, they said that there are only 40. Whereas the Indian part had few hundreds. They said, we cannot protect you, we cannot go. So it was like, nowhere for us, standing under the sun without any protection. That was the goodbye. So a lot of crying, because there are so many artists actually involved with the whole thing, the experience, their parents experienced this partition. Some of my photographs. So I made another journey to India to see that side actually on my own eyes, and wanted to feel how it looks like actually from there. So of course I did not say that I am from Bangladesh. I said I'm I'm Indian. So that's how they allowed me to go close to the fence. So that's the place, actually. That's the gate number where we met. But I took this photograph from the other side. So the fence looks like this. But you still can see some of the places don't have fence, and people are, taking shower to our river, and then putting their clothes also on them. So that's happening. So there is this another project called Rashmunjiri. This is a different story. It's a food story. And this is a very recent work that I did for Art Dubai, that was like Art Dubai Commission. And this Rashmunjiri is a sweet that you can see, and that's from my hometown, Gaibandha. So it is related to partition because this guy, Ramesh Ghosh, he was living near Dhaka. He was born there. And during the time, of the partition, in late 40s, that time actually going to Dhaka from my hometown was like 4 days, 5 days journey. So we don't know when there was this partition, and of course, it's a very weird partition, and religion was one of the, vital point to divide us from each other, because Bangladesh and Pakistan, we were not together. The physical spaces are so far from each other. So we became East Pakistan, and we were under West Pakistan. we became independent only in 1971. But anyway, this guy, Ramesh Ghosh, came to my city, my town. That's a small village, actually, with his family, and refused to go to India. A lot of Hindus were moving to India that time. So it's a mystery that he stopped himself in Gaibandha. And then he started doing this mystical Rashmanjari, which became very famous, and that made my country also famous. I mean, my hometown famous. So I told the story there, and I asked the audience to tell their story. I have Labdiang from Northeast India, Maya from Russia, and I had my co-artist from India, but she's a Punjabi background Indian. She had also, her parents had some other stories. So everybody was, I had 2 days performances, and I did not know Mirasha, that my co-artist. She is also from a Muslim background, and she moved to Dubai. And there was Baranis Lal, also she has a Punjabi story, and the Syrian guy who was talking about it. So this Modinat Jumeirah, the chef, actually I gave the recipe to them, and they made the Rashmanjari for the people to test. But interestingly, Ramesh Ghosh did not go to India, but his family went afterwards, after his death in 1989. So, it's something, some way or other it happens. All his sons and daughters, they shifted to India. So there is this migration that maybe he did not see it, but it happened. And the Rashmanjari became unpopular after him, because the guy who already took over this one, he's the extended family of Ramesh Ghosh, he was telling me that it's also related to the food and food politics nowadays, because the milk, that the guy was naturally giving, that was maybe during his time, it was like 2 to 3 liters per day. But we push them to give like 30 to 40 liters now. So, how can it be the same thing? So that's what so there was like in Bangladesh, religion has become a big fact also. So nowadays, putting this shidur on my forehead, or this shakha, that we never thought that will be an issue for us to wear. It's part of the fashion, but now people will question you. Are you Hindu? Why are you wearing this? So after the performance, after the storytelling, we both came out and we put our shidur on our forehead, and then shakha also. So that was the part of it. And since it is talking about the religion, I would go for another video. I have only 2 minutes something. So it has become, the religion has become a big issue in Bangladesh also. Maybe it's from the 9/11, after 9/11, it has become a really, really, vital issue. And people like us who are actually kind of atheist or non-believers, we have become very small. So there is a video, I think we should start from the beginning, that I wanted to show, because this is what Bangladesh is now. It's a 5 minutes video, but I will go for I will try to finish it on time. So although the partition was set like 75 years ago, a religion-based migration is still functioning today, till today, yeah. After the partition in 1941, about like 28% population were Hindus. 1951, then East Pakistan, Bangladesh after 71, of course, the proportion declined to 22%. However, according to 2022, as counting 7.9% Hindus live in Bangladesh, which may be, I think, less, than that. Thank you very much.
Ulakut, Tungatsugitsi, Dr. Heather Igloliorte Uvunga, Nakamik. Good day, welcome. I'm Dr. Heather Igloliorte, and thank you for having me here. I want to thank the March event organizers and the Sharjah Biennale for inviting me to participate in this panel. And to my fellow panelists, it's a real honor to be here, and I just want to say in my culture, hosting is really important, being a good host, and everyone at the Sharjah Biennale has been amazing. The food has been phenomenal, just every part of this has been really fantastic. As indigenous peoples of what is now known as North America, we are always thinking historically in the present. That is to say, we understand ourselves within a continuum of our ancestors and descendants. And so we always introduce ourselves first, not as academics or curators or artists, but in terms of who our relations are and what land we belong to. I am the daughter of an Inuk father and a white settler Newfoundland mother. On my Inuit side, my father, James Igloliorte, is the son of Matthew Igloliorte of Nain and Susanna Mitsuk of Hopedale. My dad was born on the land in a little island called Shango, just outside of Hopedale, and I grew up here in Happy Valley Goose Bay because my father went to residential school just here above it, Northwest River. That's my grandmother, Susie, my anak in the photo. She's a well-respected seamstress and an artist in Nunatsiavut. So I am from Nunatsiavut, which is the most easterly Inuit region in what is now known as Canada. There are 4 northern Inuit territories within the Arctic Canada that are now divided by provincial borders, as well as, of course, Yupik, Inupiaq, and Alutiiq in what is today known as Alaska, Siberia, and Russia, and Inuit in Kalaalleq or Greenland. There are, of course, many other indigenous peoples in the global north. There are about 40 indigenous peoples in Russia alone, and there are Dene and other First Nations in what is now known as Canada, just as there are many Alaskan natives in other northern territories. But Inuit and Sami seem to share a particular affinity. For Sami peoples, Sapmi, their land, is also crossed by several modern nation-state borders, now known as Norway, Sweden, Finland, and parts of Russia. As an indigenous person from the circumpolar world, there are many aspects of today's panel that do not directly correlate to my research or experience, as we are not yet experiencing the mass migration into our territories that more southern urban centers are. But what I can discuss is how some artists in the circumpolar world are responding to present ecological concerns and our looming environmental catastrophes resulting from mining, resource extraction, capitalism, disenfranchisement, green colonialism, and other aspects of ongoing settler colonialism that disproportionately impact Arctic peoples, and how nation-state borders continue to divide us in an attempt to prevent our indigenous solidarities and share our frameworks and strategies for fostering cultural sovereignty and resilience through refusal and resistance. In recent years, Inuit and Sami have been developing new theories, critical perspectives, and practices that may provide pathways for rethinking our collective responsibilities to the land and our interactions with the rapidly changing environment. Today I'm going to do so by examining some of the artworks and artists included in the Contemporary Circumpolar Art Exhibition Among All These Tundras, which I co-curated with two of my white settler doctoral students, Carissa von Haringa and Amy Prouty. Their research centers respectively on the global exhibition of circumpolar art and the ways in which artists based in the North maintain a high degree of mobility between the North and South to exhibit their work or participate in residencies, workshops, biennials. And I want to just note that the South for us is highly relative. You know, a major art production southern city might be Mexico City, but it could also be, we also think of it as, you know, Toronto is a southern city, New York, London, Copenhagen. It's all the South to us. My discussion of this exhibition today includes excerpts from our exhibition text, as well as the introduction that we have co-authored for a forthcoming edited volume, Arctic Prisms, which expands upon the themes of the exhibition and includes new essays by Sami and Inuit scholars, all translated into indigenous languages, as well as French and English. There have been a few group Sami and Inuit contemporary art exhibitions. The first is probably this 2006 exhibition, In the Shadow of the Midnight Sun, which looked at contemporary circumpolar art between 2000 and 2005. Over the last decade, circumpolar collaborations have been growing significantly. This includes most recently Gerald McMaster's touring exhibition, Arctic Amazon, which explores some of the themes of this panel more closely. There's also a growing body of scholarship. I've recently co-edited this book, Kumit Kukiria, Art, Culture, and Sovereignty Across Inuit, Nunaat, and Sapmi with Dr. Anna Hudson and Jan-Erik Lundström. It's a 38-chapter volume including scholarly essays, interviews, exhibition texts, photo essays, short stories, and personal reflections from around the circumpolar world, focusing on land, language, decolonial politics, community, and sovereignty. From Sapmi, the Office of Contemporary Art Norway has just completed a compelling series of edited volumes that bring Sami into conversation with global art historians, curators, and artists. This culminated with the volume on the Sami Pavilion. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Sami takeover of the Nordic Pavilion during the 59th edition of the Venice Biennale this past summer. The Sami Pavilion included Iran 360, the immersive video project produced in partnership with the International Sami Film Institute, the Norwegian Film Institute, and the Office of Contemporary Art Norway. They very generously extended the 360 film screening opportunity, which took place in this giant lavu. They extended that opportunity to Indigenous artists of Northern Canada through the Indigenous Screen Office, and I'm very grateful to have had the privilege of playing a small part in co-producing some of the 6 Canadian films that were shown in Iran 360. The 13 films that were shown in this enormous Lavu theater consider the past, present, and future for circumpolar peoples along a great continuum tied to our homelands and responding variously to archives, collections, land, water, oral histories, family stories, and include mermaids, monsters, and radical futurities. Related to the theme of yesterday morning's panel, the confluence of these exhibitions, events, and new scholarship make the case that the field of circumpolar art studies is a new history in the making. The title of the exhibition, Among All These Tundras, is drawn from an illustrated poem called My Home is in My Heart by famed Sami poet Niels Aslak Valkeapää, or Alohas in Sami. It features 20 works by 12 artists from around the circumpolar world. The regions from which they hail, throughout Inuit Nunaat, that's everything from Russia straight through to Greenland, and Sapmi share histories of colonialism and both experience and resist its ongoing legacies today. Time doesn't allow me to discuss all of these works, so I've decided to focus on the ones that are most relevant to what we're talking about in this panel today, about art, borders, and environmental concerns. Drawing together a diverse range of artistic practices, including media art, video, photography, sculpture, text installation, performance, and mixed media, the works presented in Among All These Tundras invite viewers to contemplate relationships between the textual and embodied Indigenous knowledge, humor, and resilience, sovereignty and self-determination, and our collective responsibility to Arctic life and land. My inspiration for this exhibition came from attending the first Arctic Arts Summit in Harstad, Norway in 2017, an international biennial event that is surely cementing the future of this nascent field. The summit was founded by powerhouse Sami arts administrator Maria Utsi to address the fact that decisions about the future of the North were being made far from it, especially in regards to resource management and global environmental issues, and with the conspicuous absence of a discussion of the Arctic peoples who live there, their arts and culture. The first Arctic Art Summit was focused on international collaboration and policy development. The second in Rovaniemi, Finland in 2019 had a more scholarly bent. And the third, held in Whitehorse, Yukon in 2022, for which I was the coordinating producer and curator of visual arts, was centered on Indigenous art and artists under the theme Connection to the Land. In Harstad, I had attended an exhibition called Subsistence and was struck by the confluence of works from around the circumpolar world, focused around the title theme as related to food sovereignty, ethical harvesting practices, land-based knowledge, and more. I was particularly taken by the work of performance artist Alison Akuchuk-Warden, who performed twice at the summit. She's from Alaska. Once, as seen here in her Ancestor from the Future regalia, who, bedecked in this neon ensemble, rapped to youth about remembering their potential and loving themselves. Secondly, they performed as Siku Siku, which became the first work selected for Among All These Tundras for its demonstration of the power of Indigenous languages. This work is a cornerstone of the exhibition because one of the major themes is language. As an Inupiaq performance artist, Warden embodies both verbal and textual expressions in the Inupiaq language, using the metaphor of ice to simultaneously invoke the devastating effects of methamphetamine use in her northern community, as well as the spiritual life-giving power of ice as a site of land-based knowledge. In the performance, which was given at the opening of each installation of Among All These Tundras, it toured to 6 places, Warden embodies 2 characters. First, a person from their community who has succumbed to addiction, and second, a person from their community who, taking another path, has become a fluent Inupiaq language speaker, speaking from the place of knowledge, the flow edge, and sharing that knowledge with the audience by teaching them Inupiaq. And it was quite magical at each installation that she would come out speaking in the second persona entirely in Inupiaq, and still was able to immediately get the audience learning to count, to identify themselves, to point at colors and make other connections entirely through her language. Both personas were treated with incredible care and humility and humanity. Both offered wisdom. In the final stage of the performance, the artist begins to document the words they are teaching, hopping down off the plinth to cover it with a record of the language transmitted, which then became an archive inside of the exhibition. The focus on language is important because of the efforts made today to revitalize and preserve Arctic Indigenous languages and how that ties into all aspects of Arctic culture. The period of rapid colonization from the 17th to the 19th centuries brought missionaries, as well as scientists, explorers, anthropologists, military, and so on, to regions throughout the circumpolar north. All these newcomers introduced text and written language under the guise of education to cultures whose histories, identities, and knowledge domains had been transmitted primarily through oral storytelling and material and embodied practices. Processes of geographic displacement and forced settlement and resettlement, together with attempts to suppress and altogether eliminate our Indigenous languages, oral histories, and customary practices, practices which were viewed as heathen or pagan, and a threat to Western European notions of progress, supported broader efforts by colonial nations to legitimize their territorial and ideological control of the North through conversion to various forms of Christianity and assimilation within Western European socio-cultural norms. Language, as Clifford Geertz has aptly stated, is not merely a tool of communication, but a complete cultural system. Its irreplaceable words, vocabularies, and grammatical structures both embody and transmit knowledge of the environment, living traditions, stories, and relations. The care inherent in the current revival of Indigenous Northern languages beyond contemporary art world concerns is therefore paramount to circumpolar artists and curators, as well as land defenders, lawyers, educators, and so on. This is a segue into another major theme of the exhibition, land, and our urgent need to protect it and be responsible to it. Barry Pottle, an Inuk photographic artist, focuses on how urban-dwelling Indigenous peoples have access to what we call country food, meaning fresh, healthy food harvested from our lands, skies, and waters, such as caribou, berries, salmon, Arctic char, ptarmigan, seal, shellfish. We have extremely high imported packaged food prices in the north because 90% of our communities in what is now known as Canada are fly-in or boat-in only, which has led to a lot of food insecurity in Canadian Arctic communities. Some of the country's most impoverished peoples pay 4 to 5 times for healthy groceries what urban dwelling people in southern Canada pay, while junk food remains readily available and cheap. Yet healthy country food from the north is likewise scarce in urban communities of indigenous peoples because it is very cost prohibitive and risky to ship frozen meat or berries or fish from the south. It often spoils on the journey and usually gets lost and then spoils on the journey. And my Facebook is replete with people lamenting their finding, spoiled food from the airport. Pottle draws our attention to many challenges associated with food security for indigenous peoples today. In Nunatsiavut, where he and I are both from, a massive flagrant fraud of billions of dollars over budget hydroelectric dam, Muskrat Falls, now threatens not only to further impoverish the region, but also to poison our sources of healthy country food, perhaps forever because of methyl mercury. In 2017, artist Billy Goche, seen there in the white coat, conducted a successful month-long hunger strike, joined by others as part of a larger protest for which 30 people were arrested and charged, to finally compel the company to do the bare minimum to protect the local environment from the worst impacts of development by removing vegetation near the reservoir that would mitigate the spread of the methyl mercury already present. Work was stopped and promises made to end the PR nightmare that was the hunger strike, but in the months that followed, we learned that we had been lied to and that the changes promised would not be completely, but only partially fulfilled. Just last week, we witnessed the hopefully successful sit-in of Sami reindeer herders and activists, mostly young people, many artists, protesting against the continued persistence of 151 wind turbines on Sami reindeer herding and calving grounds by occupying entrances to several government ministries. The Supreme Court of Norway has already ruled in Sami favor, following an apology by the government for violating the rights of Sami reindeer herders with the construction of the turbines in the Fosen region of Western Norway. These turbines, which are still in operation despite the Supreme Court ruling declaring them illegal in October of 2021. These actions are tied to a third major theme of the exhibition, our rights to sovereignty and self-determination over our lands, waters, and bodies. Between 2018 and 2020, Marja Helander explored the link between the mining industry and today's standard of living and culture of consumption, and in particular, the impact of mining on the sensitive northern ecology. In her work, Helander emphasizes the dependence between people and nature. In a series of large-scale photos and diptychs, Helander depicts sites of mining and resource extraction at sunrise, sunset, and nightfall in quiet moments when the development activities are silent, sometimes incorporating herself into the landscape as a human taking the form of an animal, thus identifying with Sami oral traditions about transformation. Helander says, quote, "As a Sami person, I want to highlight the corporality of people and how humans are just one animal species among many, dependent on nature, ecosystems, and the land. We are part of the cyclicity of nature, a pile of particles and molecules. Circumpolar peoples are united in their desire to protect these northern ecologies and human and non-human life alike, and to resist the deleterious effects of climate change, mineral and hydrocarbon resource extraction, encroaching industry, and transnational competition. When we started working on Among All These Tundras, my co-curators and I thus believed that it was an exhibition about refusal, protest, activism, resistance to colonial violence. It is very much about these things. Yet as we pulled the works together and considered the artist's oeuvres and what each piece was conveying, we realized that the overarching theme was not outrage, but love. Yes, we are resisting outside forces, but we do so because we love what is worth protecting. Dominican-American writer Juan Diaz coined the term decolonial love as, quote, "the only kind of love that could liberate us from the horrible legacy of colonial violence." And scholar, poet, educator, and activist Leanne Simpson has later expanded upon this framework in her similarly titled book of short fiction. Decolonial love means shedding the shame and violence of being an Indigenous person and not defending our difference, but refusing its rejection in order to prioritize our kinship structures, our relationships to the land and non-human entities, our knowledges and ways of being. Rooted in his love for this side of Greenland that tourists never see, Inuit Storch included, I think this very series included in this Biennale, Inu's land-based, compelling, and quirky photographs from his At Home We Belong series challenge and destabilize dominant outsider narratives of Kalalit by restoring the land with images of family and familiarity. A Sunayak video work rock piece in which the land appears to breathe and then birth and then re-envelop the artist in a stop motion that goes for about 2 minutes, exhibits another facet of decolonial love, reflecting on the potential of the land to heal and drawing on an embodied connection between land and self-care. In We Glow the Way We Choose to Glow, Alison Kuchik-Warden personalizes new media in reconnection to generations of Inupiaq through a single family heirloom carved by her uncle, a small polar bear that was gifted to the artist. Three-dimensionally scanned and printed 27 times in bright glow-in-the-dark filament, the original bear is reproduced and arranged in a luminescent rainbow that symbolically bridges the place of the future ancient, while foregrounding decolonial love for queer Indigenous youth and their futurity beyond colonial time and space. Tusarsau'vunga, the mixed media installation work by Inuit artist and curator Takrilik Partridge, is a series of Inuit women's beaded front pieces that adorn the amauti, that's like a woman's parka, incorporating both natural materials and found objects, materials used to relocate and re-narrativize the culturally symbolic space in a settler colonial context, using materials such as you can see here, emergency blanket, tarp, beads, coins, fishing lures, and the like. The material and conceptual groundwork activates this decolonial love through the making process, which speaks to generations of adaptation and resilience by Inuit seamstresses as cultural workers, knowledge holders, and caretakers. This series is tied to her new series, Build My Own Home, those are Amautis, that reflects on homelessness and the housing crisis in the North, especially hidden homelessness among women and children, and makes parkas out of family patterns using materials typically used to build various kinds of shelters, from the permanent to emergency materials like tarp and newspaper. In her work, Partridge explores how to turn scarcity into abundance and to express care for the fellow Inuit through everyday acts like sewing and beading. Finally, Sami artist and architect Yuar Nango likewise explores themes, structures, and sanctuary through the original form of shelter in clothing, through his Sami Shelter series and across many of his works. While Nango is better known for creating built environments inside and beyond gallery walls for biennials, documenta, and the like, these sweaters reflect his interest in what he calls the original architecture of shelter, clothing. These traditional Norwegian sweaters display real-life knitted examples of the modern Lavu-inspired buildings that today blend Indigenous and Nordic architectural elements. In so doing, Nango nods to the Sami tradition of semi-nomadism while highlighting their capacity for adaptation. It is these qualities that have allowed his people to survive both physical dispossession and Norwegianization, centuries of harsh policies enacted by the government to force cultural assimilation on Sami peoples. The artisan among all these tundras offer alternative futures for the circumpolar north, which transcend narratives of precarity, loss, and ongoing colonial and ecological dispossession, and instead indicate potential ways forward towards environmental justice, the flourishing of Indigenous languages, and the return of our stewardship of the land. This, they demonstrate, can be envisioned through dynamic engagements with the arts, land-based practices, social justice movements, and grounded in community, solidarity between peoples, and decolonial love. Thank you. Nakami.
I'd like to thank Khullar Al-Qasimi and Salah Hassan for the kind invitation to participate in the March meeting. It's an honor and pleasure to be here today. I'd also like to express my warmest appreciation to the Sharjah Art Foundation team for the extraordinary hospitality they've extended over the past few days. Maria, Najiba, Shema, Amar, Hajar, Hissa, Lama, Abid, Shireen, and many others, you've been models of skill and grace. Thank you. A Million Stories Blew into the Sky declares a work from Minam Apang's series of drawings, War with Stars, which evokes the theme of our gathering, the post-colonial constellation. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, constellation signifies the configuration or position of stars in regard to one another, as supposed to have influence on terrestrial things. A second meaning, now obsolete, is, quote, fate or destiny, disposition, propensity, or character, as determined or influenced by one's stars. While organizers of the March meeting and Aquianwezor might have intended a more disenchanted definition for constellation, such as that provided by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, a group or cluster of related things, it is the other meanings that I would like to invoke in this presentation on how Apang and other contemporary artists have come to redraw the boundaries of India's Northeast, a contact zone between South, East, and Southeast Asia, by taking fate into their own hands, manipulating the stars, shaping their destinies, and imagining environments in the wake of war, violence, migration, partition, and ecological disaster. From a million cuts and wounds, they stitch together millions of stories, songs, sketches, and scrolls. Consider how the lower half of this image resembles a topographical view of landscape with hills, rivers, and plains like that made by a surveyor, and an anatomical drawing of vascular systems or layers of epidermis with veins, capillaries, and arteries like that made by a physician. In the upper half, amorphous shapes evoke cloud formations and dreamlike visions. This world of human and non-human animals, of birds, crocodiles, fish, ghosts, spirits, and trees, suggests migrations and partitions through which northeastern India has been divided into hills and plains, castes and tribes, Christians and quote-unquote animists by colonial and post-colonial state-making processes. Its inhabitants are pulled up to the water and pushed toward the sky, crisscrossing mountains and rivers in movements without end. War with Stars retells origin stories recorded by Anglican missionary turned anthropologist Verrier Elwin in Myths of the Northeast Frontier of India of 1958, an anthology published by the Indian government to which Elwin was advisor on tribal affairs. Apang depicts rival fish and star clans going to war over a slain otter, a never-ending story, an epic, unending war, as the artist puts it. Spurred by the revelations of a drunk, telltale bat, the conflict in her series continues on stormy nights when the fish come up to the surface of the water. In this work from the series, fish push against the surface of water, denoted by thick black lines and inky blots and splotches. Their bodies bleed and blur even as their eyes, scales, and fins are rendered with detail and precision. Across the series, Apang portrays movement across earth and sky in wavy broken lines to convey liquid worlds of history and memory, orality and literacy, poetry and ink painting. Although War with Stars refers to mythical creatures and environments, its storms, skies, battles, armies, and journeys reverberate in the present. Rich in natural resources and home to large indigenous, Christian, and Muslim populations, northeastern India has been the site of secessionist movements and subject to the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA, passed in 1958, a reworking of the Colonial Armed Forces Special Powers Ordinance of 1942, which grants the state extraordinary means to pursue presumed terrorists in disturbed areas. British colonial Assam province, which you see on this map, roughly corresponds to contemporary northeastern India. Over 6 decades, AFSPA has become a permanent regime in northeastern India with little to no checks on military and paramilitary authority. Militarization is compounded by resource extraction. Did I skip a slide? Okay, all right. Militarization is compounded by resource extraction, complex operations of caste, tribe, race, and ethnicity, and geopolitical calculations by India, China, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. Assam, the largest state by population in northeastern India, I'm going to actually go back because I think I am missing some slides. Assam, the largest state by population in northeastern India, has been ground zero for implementing the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens, discriminatory laws and state policies around migration, and historical effects of partition. Tangjam Ibopishak's poem, The Land of Half-Humans, describes a place, possibly the state of Manipur, as head without body and body without head. The partial broken forms of Ibopishak's half-humans refer to a historical experience of violence that has produced incomplete citizens who emerge as immigrants relative to a normative ideal of Indian citizenship, according to sociologist Papuri Bora. The 8 Indian states, Assam, Nagaland, Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Arunachal Pradesh, Tripura, and Sikkim, that border China, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal, are commonly known as the Northeast, a military and administrative category dating to the British colonial period. Artists and writers have repurposed this category, as in Parismita Singh's anthology, Centerpiece, Art and Writing from India's Northeast, which focuses on work by women and plays on logics of center and periphery. An artist and writer based in Guwahati, Assam, Singh asserts, quote, like many other terms with a controversial past, some contain within them a potential for their reclaiming by the people they describe. She understands her project as an act of turning on its head the idea of a hostile, exotic, racialized entity for an identity based on shared history and experience of insurgencies, uprisings, wars, as well as the weight of counterinsurgency and violence. The Northeastern diaspora, specifically communities in Delhi, Bengaluru, and Kolkata, are crucial to Singh's idea of the Northeast. She writes, migrants from this region to other parts of India who went to study or work often develop solidarities beyond their own ethnic or political identities, identifying as Northeastern when forced into cheap housing with others from this region in urban ghettos or while mobilizing for protests and rights. Although migration across international boundaries, especially from global south to north, dominates news headlines and political imaginations, much migration, an estimated 75%, occurs within nation states. The most common pattern is circular and continuous, that is not wrought by a single historical event, whether partition, civil war, or climate change. Beyond populations understood as economic migrants, most of the world's displaced persons, 85% according to the UNHCR, are hosted in the global south, with Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, and Iran counting for the greatest numbers in 2016. In 2019, Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, and Uganda topped the list. Displacements in the global south often have colonial histories and are complicated by political conflicts, land grabs, environmental devastation, and ethnic or religious persecution, as the embattled status of the Rohingya within and across nation states demonstrates. Chinmay Tumbe proposes that such migration patterns are long-standing, centuries old in some case, and migration in India with an estimated 60 to 100 million migrant workers has no terminal date. In northeastern India, here, such movements can be understood as resistance to state power and state-making processes. According to James Scott and Willem van Schendel, flows of persons and things in upland Southeast Asia, encompassing parts of India, China, Burma, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand, date to antiquity and persist, confounding state-based thinking around citizenship and belonging. Contrary to right-wing discourses, migrants relocate to the cities and countrysides of South Asia and return home, sometimes moving across national boundaries on a daily basis. Less migration crisis than everyday condition, as evident from Shilpa Gupta's Untitled, a body of work shown at the Venice Biennale in 2015 as part of the collateral exhibition, My East is Your West. Gupta follows the movement of persons and things along the Bangladesh-India border, where a 4,096-kilometer-long, 8-foot-high barbed wire fence, the world's longest security barrier, has been erected to control migration. A robust, paralegal, and sometimes deadly trade in cloth, cattle, and codeine-based cough syrup, legal in India, illegal in Bangladesh, flourishes there. The artist marks that traffic with unraveled yarn. That's what you're looking at here, with unraveled yarn from a fine hand-woven cotton sari and bone china fragments in vitrines, accompanied by her field notes and people's narratives of travel to, from, and across the border. These shadowy, if also habitual migrations are produced by a history of partitions. The partition of Bengal in 1905, the partition of British India in 1947, and the partition of Pakistan in 1971 with the Bangladesh War. Migration and partition are intimately linked. Bani Abedi's 12-minute film, The Distance from Here, shows how a history of partition lends ordinary movements in South Asia an extraordinary charge, rendering them at once tense and bureaucratic as Pakistani visa applicants endure long lines and waiting rooms at a fictive Indian embassy. With hired actors on a set, Abedi restages the spatial logics of partition and its transformations of here and there, near and far, home and abroad. Lahore and Amritsar, major cities and Punjab provinces of Pakistan and India, respectively, are 31 miles apart on the Grand Trunk Road. In its affect, The Distance from Here recalls the beating retreat ceremony at the Wagah-Atari border, the closest international land crossing between those cities, a military tradition, tourist attraction, and occasion to contemplate difference and identity among residents of a once unified, now divided Punjab. As I have argued elsewhere, Abedi and Gupta's projects enact everyday partitions, whereby artists take a critical approach to the South Asian region that dislocates partition from a fixed point in the past and recasts it as an incomplete process. Like partition, migration too might be understood as process rather than event, as recurring, performative, intimate, and mundane rather than exceptional. While widely circulating media images of flights from Saigon and Kabul at the end of American wars point to a decisive moment of migration following the model of Henri Cartier-Bresson, the lives and stories of those migrants and others are unfolding, as Viet Thanh Nguyen and Ocean Vuong have insisted in their writing on the American War in Vietnam. Zarina Bhimji's Out of Blue, a film shot in Uganda, where the artist was born and from which she was expelled in 1972, suggests unfinished business in Africa, Asia, and Europe as a flight takes off from an airstrip at Entebbe Airport. Studio Camps, From Gulf to Gulf to Gulf, a film documenting the traffic in wooden boats and Gujarati sailors across the Arabian Sea from the Gulfs of Kutch and Kambat to the Persian Gulf, or rather I should say the Arabian Gulf, the Gulf region, shows incessant journeys and returns, movements of people and livestock without permanent residency, and a citizenship of the sea that links maritime communities in India, Pakistan, Iran, and Somalia. Most expulsions, partitions, and migrations are without end. Their effects are marked on the landscape and its human and non-human inhabitants. In a work from Zubeni Lotha's series, How Do I Look?, two women face off in a wooded landscape. Attired in camouflage, holding rifles, and wearing combat boots, their faces covered by bird-shaped masks that the artist had fabricated locally for the shoot. Their yellow beaks evoke the great hornbill, native to South and Southeast Asia, and an emblem of the state-sponsored Hornbill Festival established in 2004, which celebrates Naga culture and brings tourists to Nagaland. Staged in Kisama, a constructed village on the historic Burma Road that links Kohima to Imphal and beyond, the inaugural festival gathered beautiful Naga girls adorned with shells, bells, and colorful beads, along with handsome Naga men with tattoos and feathers, trying hard to look like modern warriors amid a frenzy of guns, mountain patrols, and traffic jams, according to anthropologist Dolly Kikon. Observers to this festival included Bhupinder Singh, the Director General of Assam Rifles, a paramilitary force, and a British veteran of the Second World War, whose tour of the region's battlegrounds was sponsored by his country's government. Kikon summarizes the event thus: behind the artists sat a quiet audience of thousands, Nagas, some Indians, and media, and they watched the men of war, watch the dancers, and them. Redirecting the ethnographic gaze of the Hornbill Festival and counteracting popular images of an exotic land of festivals, dances, and tribes, Lotha's series proposes that Naga culture is not one. It reconsiders gendered tropes, specifically masculinist myths of the Naga warrior and headhunter, published in anthropologist Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf's The Naked Nagas, with his primitivizing photographs of Konyak Naga peoples in the Naga Hills district of colonial Assam. Like British gazetteers, cartographers, and census takers, Heimendorf constructs the Nagas as a distinct race and tribe, though the term Naga describes diverse ethnic and linguistic groups in contemporary India and Myanmar. The term marks multiple partitions and migrations across borders of Assam, Manipur, and Nagaland in India, and Sagaing Division and Kachin State in Myanmar. Lotha's fierce and funny bird women, modeled by her cousin's wife and a friend who are police officers in Dimapur, play on artificial and arbitrary divisions of peoples, practices, and places by the colonial and post-colonial state. In another photograph from her series Dimapur 797112, so named after a zip code in the capital city of Nagaland, a girl wearing huge sunglasses and white boots stares boldly at the camera and stands next to a sign advertising Women Music Festival. She's evidently the star of the show, as an adult woman appears kind of hazily in the foreground. These performers will take the stage and remake themselves in a more joyful, if also conventional masquerade than the subjects of How Do I Look? Lotha zooms in on everyday acts and ordinary gestures in festivals where women and girls fashion their own image, by contrast to performers at the Hornbill Festival or at India's annual Republic Day Parade in New Delhi, where Naga culture is presented as static and spectacular in floats, processions, and performances. She presents her hometown and its people as dynamic and familiar through intimate views and performing routine tasks. Like the female figures in Parismita Singh's scroll, Mother, I Will Destroy Your Art, produced during the COVID-19 pandemic when schools were closed and homes became studios, offices, and workshops for children and adults. The artist traces her son's drawings onto translucent Japanese rice paper, combining his visions of dinosaurs, monsters, animals, and spirits. You see a stegosaurus here. With her observations of shifting ecology and environment, rivers run dry, mountains without forest, and parched earth. She repurposes sketches executed quickly while working for the NGO Pratham in Assam and the autonomous Bodoland territorial region, and drawings from her published work. So this is an example of published work, and there are lots of other examples of works drawn from her sketchbook. Fossilized remains from a prehistoric past float down and share ground with strange creatures from the present, such as this friendly Triceratops, as women and children observe their surroundings while seated on red, gold, brown earth that is fiery and watery, with pigments saturating and showing through the paper support. Women work through violence, minding children, preparing meals, and washing clothes in a funny and frightening landscape where human and non-human actors, T-Rex fragments, pterodactyls, stegosauruses, triceratops, and natural and cultural elements fuse together. Like the environments of War with Stars, this vision of the Northeast is replete with fear, danger, beauty, and wonder. Instead of portraying crisis and catastrophe and the end of social and cultural life, a re-enchanted world is rendered in mythic and lyrical languages through female figures and feminist viewpoints, with children's games and deep play in anthropologist Clifford Geertz's sense. These artists convey resilience, agency, irony, and political commitment as they move between genres, registers, and communities that are often viewed as separate, including visual and narrative forms, oral and written traditions, audiences for folklore and contemporary art. Apong's drawings, Lotha's photographs, and Singh's scrolls attest to the generative effects of dispersal and displacement, of being cut by a knife and killing an otter, of reaching for the stars and swimming in the river, of singing like a bird and shouting at a rock concert. Their aesthetic and political movements between the Northeast and the mainland, between folklore and fact, between nature and culture, assert a citizenship that is neither stable nor compatible with state-based, UN-decreed, or liberal democratic norms for belonging. We might view their art as acts of itinerancy and location that realign stars and planets, rearrange fortunes and predictions, and establish new systems and galaxies in a post-colonial constellation of feminist projects that dislocate India's Northeast from its usual place at the frontier and periphery and demand creative responses to conflicts and challenges arising from migration, ecology, and environment. Thank you.
I'm so grateful for the invitation to be here from the Sharjah Art Foundation and from Director Khullar Al-Qasimi, and thank you to Mariam Mumtaz for all the help, and I'm sorry for all those crazy emails I sent you about scheduling, and grateful to be in conversation with folks here. Let's make visible our radical hospitality with the hashtag Migrant Caravan. I'm reading and translating the text in the middle of the slide here that begins, Hagamos Visible. This call, issued in October 2018 by Movimiento Migrante Mesoamericano, appealed to Mexicans to help in the arrival of Central American refugees to Mexico City. The plea resonated with Jacques Derrida's 1996 dialogue on hospitality, which proposed unconditional hospitality, the complete and absolute acceptance of all immigrants, all foreigners, in the face of growing xenophobia in France. Written 3 years after the 1993 revocation of birth citizenship under then Prime Minister Michel Rocard, Derrida's call is timely for us today. This afternoon, I examine his call in conjunction with the art of Chicana, or Mexican-American artist Sandy Rodriguez, born in 1975 and working in Los Angeles, and specifically her 2019 installation, You Will Not Be Forgotten, installed in 2 rooms of the Charlie James Gallery in LA's Chinatown in 2020. How have contemporary Latinx and Chicanx artists responded to the migration crises in recent years? And by Chicana, I mean women-identified artists of Mexican descent in the United States. And by Chicanx and Latinx, I'm referring to artists of Mexican-American, Central American, and Latin American descent, using the gender-neutral, non-binary X, which also recognizes indigeneity. While migration is a global concern, its specific contours in the US are important to contextualize Rodriguez's work, particularly as we continue to emerge from the damage done during the Trump presidency. Elected in November 2016 on waves of anti-immigrant and anti-Latino sentiment, you may recall Trump sounding the alarm in 2018 about the migrant caravan from Central America heading to the US. He threatened to institute martial law and end birthright citizenship guaranteed by the 14th Amendment through executive order. 2 years later, in 2020, Joe Biden was elected US president, and in anticipation of more favorable laws and attitudes, migrants from Central America began gathering again at the US-Mexico border in hopes of successful crossing. This scenario repeated itself in July 2021, when Biden established the Collaborative Migration Management Strategy to foster more humane conditions for Northern Triangle migrants, so folks from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And then the scenario repeated itself again in December of 2022 and January 2023 in anticipation of changing US laws. In all of these instances, we were and are called to enact radical hospitality. And that ethical demand leads me to the following question. What is the role of art and artists in this current context, in the face of such human suffering? As we think about this question and consider Sandy Rodriguez's 2019-2020 installation, You Will Not Be Forgotten, I will suggest that visual artists can play an important and specific role in the current political crisis. The installation was part of the artist's ongoing series, the Codex Rodriguez Mondragon. The first iteration, I'm showing you here, dating from 2018, was comprised of maps, botanical drawings, and sculptures created using indigenous pigments, techniques, and materials, such as amate paper or matal. It focused on actions taken against immigrants, and I'm showing you now the third iteration, which just opened in Santa Barbara last week. As suggested by Ela Diaz and Ananda Kona Ponte in their analysis of the first installation's large-scale map from 2018, de las señales y pronósticos y ice raids in el sanctuary state of Califas, Rodriguez visualizes the connections between recent deportations in California and the events of the 16th century European invasion or conquest of the Americas. Today's deportations result from centuries of dehumanization of indigenous peoples. The authors also analyze the artist's deep engagement with the Florentine Codex, a manuscript in Nahuatl and Spanish compiled around 1577 by Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún and his Central Mexican indigenous collaborators. Diaz and Kona Ponte suggest the ways in which Rodriguez takes inspiration from the Florentine Codex as a repository of indigenous culture, history, and tradition. The second iteration of 2020, You Will Not Be Forgotten, was comprised of 20 works. It was, in the artist's own words, quote, dedicated to the 7 Central American child migrants who died in U.S. Customs and Border Protection during 2018 and 2019, end quote. 7 portraits memorialized these deceased children, featured on the main wall in the first room. Other works included representations of indigenous Mesoamerican grandmother goddesses, landscapes of the US-Mexico border that commemorated the children's final days and document the location of healing plants, 3 portraits of contemporaries as indigenous healers, and including this beautiful self-portrait, and small botanical illustrations of plants able to heal the children's ailments, including susto, or trauma, influenza, respiratory illnesses, and diseases of the heart, based in the artist's careful study of indigenous plant knowledge in the Florentine Codex. Similar to the first incarnation of the Codex Rodriguez Mondragon, You Will Not Be Forgotten was created after intensive fieldwork along the border in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas in 2019, gathering medicinal plants and natural pigments. It was a process dedicated to decolonizing our past, offering hope for the present and a more just future for the Americas. My interest is in the 7 commemorative portraits of the children. Grief and rage compelled Rodriguez to create these when the deaths of the children became known through the media and activist orgs. She began working on portraits, each an amalgam created from photographs gathered from websites, complemented by research into each child's life. First, she executed sketches in walnut ink on amate paper, each small in size, so they're about 4 by 6 inches, attempting to capture the essence of each child when alive. These became the basis of the 7 large portraits, also rendered in walnut ink on amate paper, or matal, Nahua word, handmade in Mexico from big tree bark, a process dating back to ancient times. 6 of the 7 final portraits have blue-green backgrounds, perhaps in allusion to the famous Maya blue pigment, a natural colorant created from indigo and clay. The background reminds viewers that the children came from Central America, a Maya area. Because the blue-green color employed here was associated in Maya culture with death and with the priesthood, one could read its use as intended to sacralize the children, or perhaps even suggest they were sacrificial victims. The first portrait in the series represents Felipe, born in Guatemala. His name, birth, and death dates are inscribed in cursive, similar to the inscriptions found on colonial-era portraits. Let's look at Rodriguez's transformations of the sketch. You'll notice how she has sharpened her line, moving from light, descriptive strokes in the sketch that bring the figure into being to bolder, more graphic contours. She also enlarges his figure and shifts the angle of the body up for more monumental presentation. She draws attention to his eyes, large and at the viewer's level, their gaze now almost confrontational. To suggest Felipe as he was in life, she adds more torsion to the positioning of the body, also opening it up. The transformations seen here in the portrayal of Felipe will characterize the others. They include, number one, the monumentalization of the pose, number two, an emphasis on the eyes, and number three, the use of a bolder, more graphic line in the finished portrait. The final image of this series portrays 2-year-old Wilmer. The freer pose here is reminiscent of a snapshot. His head tilted to the right, Rodriguez enhances the torsion of Wilmer's body, suggesting the energy of a 2-year-old boy. He looks up at us with large, dark brown eyes, his eyebrows emphasizing their sadness, his mouth downturned. In comparing Rodriguez's sketch to the final portrait, we notice again her graphic line and how she reduced the angle of Wilmer's body to make him more monumental, his pose more commanding, even confrontational. And this is heightened by our close-up view. And similar strategies can be seen in the others, such as this one of 7-year-old Jacqueline. It's one of the most poignant and evocative of the series. Or in this depiction of 16-year-old Juan. 10-year-old Darling is placed in the center of the series, the darkest in tonality and the only portrait without a blue-green background. It serves as a visual anchor. We see Darling's face in the final work through the vertical, wavy striations of the amate paper, as if a ghostly apparition underwater. Here, the artist highlighted the eyes, enlarging the head. Our brief examination of these portraits revealed how the artist intentionally monumentalized the children's poses, focused her attention on their eyes, and used a bolder, more graphic line in the final versions as compared to the initial sketches. I now consider the portraits in two different contexts: visual practices of memorialization in Mexican American culture and visual rhetorics of sacred art. Mexican Americans are heirs to a rich tradition of memorializing the deceased. The observation of Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, November 1st and 2nd, is the most obvious example, but home altars, ofrendas, and roadside shrines also come to mind. It is helpful to think of Sandy's installation in this context. She herself creates altares for Dia de los Muertos. In November 2020, Rodriguez was in fact the guest curator of Self-Help Graphics' virtual altar exhibition in East Los Angeles. So she is deeply familiar with Mexican visual traditions of memorializing the dead. She did not choose a traditional altar format, though, to commemorate the children, instead opting for something more enigmatic and participatory. And allow me to show you a more traditional altar honoring the Central American children. This also dates from November 2020, created by the highly respected East Los Angeles altar artist Ofelia Rosana Esparza, and this is in East LA again. I'm also interested in how Rodriguez's work resonates with past imagery. I'm not suggesting direct lines of influence, but I'm more concerned with how her portrayals are haunted by past images and practices. How do these historic practices haunt, return to, persist in contemporary art? One of these is traditional funerary portraits of children called Angelito or Little Angel portraits, the name given to deceased babies and youth in Mexico who are commemorated during the Day of the Dead celebration. Popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries, these photographic portraits are based on earlier colonial renditions done in oils, as discussed by art historian Elisa Mandel. Whereas the colonial examples were commissioned by members of the elite, photography brought this commemorative portrait type into the reach of even modest families. Chicana artist Judith Hernandez created a stunning work in pastel inspired by this tradition in 2015, her Death of the Innocents. I think of it as an important precedent for Rodriguez's work. The piece was created under similar circumstances in response to the deaths of child migrants crossing the border into the US, as well as the generalized violence provoked by the cartels in Mexico. I've interpreted it as an echo of or as haunted by Mexican postmortem photographs, as we see in this comparison. I bring into play now other explicitly sacred images, such as this Holy Face of Christ from 1631 by Spanish artist Francisco de Zurbarán. The painting fictively renders the relic of the Sudarium or the Veil of Veronica. During the Passion of Christ, as he carried the cross to Calvary, a woman offered to wipe Christ's face. His visage was left miraculously imprinted on her veil, a true image, or vera icona in Latin, on it. The image brings to mind various of Rodriguez's portrayals of the children in You Will Not Be Forgotten, particularly the portrait of Darlene, positioned in the center. Other related miraculous images also come to mind, like the Sudarium on textiles, such as the Virgin of Guadalupe. According to believers, this image appeared miraculously on the tilma or cloak of native convert Juan Diego in the year 1531 in Mexico. Rodriguez's portraits, the Sudarium and the tilma of the Virgin of Guadalupe, all appeared or purportedly appeared on textiles, Veronica's veil, Juan Diego's cloak, or the portraits on amato. Byzantine icons also suggest themselves, reminiscent of Rodriguez's emphasis on the children's large, dark, imploring eyes. Like miraculous textile images, Byzantine icons also blur or interpenetrate between sacred and quotidian. While I'm not positing these sacred works as sources for Rodriguez's portraits in the traditional sense, I believe that her works produce meaning through their resonances with past sacred imagery. These visual echoes or representational hauntings operate like palimpsests, with prior meaning still evident, available to viewers to help them assign meaning. This is analogous to how a word's etymology inflects its current meaning, the latter idea proposed by Heidegger in Being and Time. Her portraits differ, though, from these precedents in that they portray the children as alive, an intentional choice, according to the artist. Others have demonstrated how Rodriguez draws on ancestral indigenous knowledge, referencing Maya and Aztec goddesses, invoking healing plants, and recreating ancient painting materials and techniques. Building on the interpretation of her artistic technique as indigenous, I understand her practice as a manifestation of what has been called post-memory, as theorized by Marianne Hirsch of Columbia. Post-memory describes the after effects of trauma, as experienced by later generations. In our case, how the traumatic experiences of conquest and colonization are passed down. As Hirsch suggests, post-memory's connection to the past, quote, is not actually mediated by recall, but by imaginative investment, projection, and creation, end quote. Rodriguez's depiction of healing plants or specimens, such as the cure for susto or shock, which killed one of the migrant children, or the insect to cure heart pain, act as spells, as cures, as brujas or curanderas, incantations to heal. I've left till the end an important matter, the consideration of portraiture. How do Rodriguez's images function within the context of Chicanx portraiture? Well, class issues complicate the status of portraiture in Mexican-American culture. As an art born from the civil rights struggles of the 60s and 70s, portraiture was not a central concern of the Chicana movement in the way that muralism or posters were, the latter designed to serve our community. The recent catalog for Printing the Revolution presents new scholarship on the topic. As curator E. Carmen Ramos notes, Chicanx artists revamped portraiture, a genre normally commissioned by wealthy elites, to recognize important historical figures and activists, as we see on the catalog's cover, which shows Emiliano Zapata. They moved portraiture from the palace or mansion to the streets in the form of posters carried in protests. By portraying civil rights icons, for example, Chicanx artists corrected the biased telling of history from which BIPOC were often excluded, as Ramos points out, and I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color. These include print portraits of people killed by the police. In 1975, Chicano artist Amado Empeña Jr. created this work, Aquellos que han muerto, to commemorate a 12-year-old boy killed by Dallas, Texas police in 1973. More recently, the artist Orey Original in Oakland, California began the portrait series Justice for Our Lives in support of Black Lives Matter, his digital prints freely available online. Bay Area artist Jesus Barraza similarly creates prints that can be downloaded, printed, and used at protests. Such prints, as Claudia Zapata points out in their essay, contest and correct negative media portrayals of the victims of police brutality. Rodriguez's portraits in You Will Not Be Forgotten remind me of these portraits, designed like hers to memorialize innocent victims. Indeed, although their medium is different, natural ink and pigments on handcrafted amate paper, Rodriguez's portraits and these poster portraits share similarities in their visual language. Notice the graphic use of line to delineate facial features, the emphasis on face and eyes, and the monumentalizing of the sitter, all articulating the desire to not forget. I end today by returning to the concept of radical hospitality with which I began, taken from Derrida's 1996 seminar. Radical hospitality opposes the notion that hospitality should be conditional, but instead unconditional, even hyperbolic. The concept is decidedly utopian. Derrida acknowledges that unconditional hospitality exceeds civic discourse and political space as they currently exist. In the face of calls for unconditional hospitality, citizens respond with, what about the need to protect home, property, and community? The response in France in 1993 of Prime Minister Rocard that, quote, France could not receive all the misery of the world, end quote, parallels responses in the United States. As a result, governments struggle to establish limits on hospitality in order to make it effective or to put it realistically into practice. Such compromises lead to restrictions and conditions that transform hospitality into a contract, a policed pact, in Derrida's words, one involving rights, duties, borders, passports, doors, and immigration laws, all designed to limit and control. In response to these real-world concerns, Derrida calls for a pure and hyperbolic hospitality to create the best possible conditions, the most just legislation, the least bad circumstances. The quest for the best conditions of hospitality, the process of perfecting this, that constitutes progress. And I would like to end by suggesting that artists can play a special role here in mediating the tensions inherent to pure hospitality, or hospitality as hyperbole. To welcome the other, to paraphrase Derrida, we must know the other's name and the other's identity. At the same time, though, we have to prevent this knowing from becoming an interrogation, a blacklist, the border patrol. We've seen today in the work of Sandy Rodriguez that artists can humanize this process of knowing by making the immigrant, refugee, or perceived foreigner known. Portraiture, by its very definition, has particular power in this regard. We are predisposed when beholding portraiture, in fact, to humanize the sitter, and we approach portraiture with certain viewing practices at the ready, practices that center our agency as viewers. And viewers' agency is central to this installation. Rodriguez's 7 portraits, while depicting individual children, also point to the structural and historical conditions that cause these tragedies. Her references to the past, in her materials, her technique, the inclusion of indigenous Mesoamerican imagery, reveal the particular power of art to bring past and present together, to illuminate how the past conditions the present, how the history of invasion, conquest, and colonization dating back to 1492 haunts us today. Thus, her work is both retrospective and prospective, to borrow terminology from Amir Eshel in his discussion of Holocaust memorials. Rodriguez offers viewers the ability or choice, the agency to make these connections on their own, a strategy built into the arrangement of the installation over 2 rooms, I would argue. This element of choice in considering the past has the potential to create for Eshel what he calls futurity. What future will we choose? Rodriguez's response here is clear in encoding hope for the future, and that hope is informed by the past. Hope in indigenous decolonizing practices, be they botanical, artistic, environmental, or cultural. Hope in sacralizing migrant children, and hope that by making detention and deportation visible, we will be moved to offer radical hospitality. It is, in other words, art's potential for hyperbole that offers hope. Its ability to portray children as saints, as gods, as cured by natural remedies and healers, as embodiments of centuries of indigenous wisdom. And to return to my opening question, that's the role of artists in the face of such human suffering. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. This has just been an amazing series of presentations, and I'm grateful to each of you. It's amazing how they relate to each other, and I think it's amazing this sense that emerges out of all of this is this sense of hope. And this is what my notepad says kind of over and over and over again, is this idea of hope in the face of such horrific ongoing circumstances, whether it's these partitions, moments of partition, the histories and recent events that Charlene is describing. In the face of all of this radical sense of the possibility of hope. And I see this as something that is planting these seeds that spread into the future. And so I love this idea, Heather, that you bring up and that you showed this performance piece, if I'm recalling the name correctly, of an ancestor from the future giving this message. And I see these presentations very much in this light. If 20 years from now, there was a recording of this, which there will be, that people could watch, that this is somewhat of a sense of us sending a message to the future. And it's a message, if I can quote each of you a little bit, this idea that Heather mentioned of decolonial love, something that is generous and generative and open-ended, and that involves histories with the sense of contemporary community building, the individual, but also a deep sense of belonging. Or Sonal, your idea of the re-enchanted world. I can't help but be completely enamored with the artist that you showed at the end, these works, which show these mythologies combined with the childlike visions, which create this sense of radicality, which I think relates very much to many of the works that were shown as a part of this, the artist's hand, this strong interest in memory inscribed on oftentimes handmade paper, which can be something which is a memorial, such as the images of the children, but something that leads into the future with a certain sense of optimism or possibility, right? Tayeba, the idea of hugging across the no man's land, right? I think this is the space that is blocked off. And of course, all of you were showing maps and delineating all of these maps, but only with the idea being that you would then dismantle them, or that the artists that you're talking about are dismantling these traditional maps, right? So I find this to be really interesting also in the sense of the ways in which so many of you are looking at performance performance artists, but also ideas of reenactment and ways of reinventing in these spaces of the no man's land, these spaces which are the ground of separation and border and violence, but are also the spaces for deep regeneration and possibility. I think I'm looking at our clock counting down, and I think I want to, knowing how active and participatory this audience has been so far, I want to go ahead and open it up for questions and comments and further thoughts. And of course, we can continue our conversation here as well. Would anyone like to?
Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much for these wonderful presentations. All of these presentations were both about migration, but also about border making or the consequences of controlling that migration, deportation, partition, forced migration, and so on. And Charlene, as you were talking about the Trump policies of building a wall, keeping Latinx out of the country, and I was also thinking of the two policies that Trump instituted exactly around the same time. One is the Muslim ban, keeping citizens of 7 countries out of America, and of course DACA, you know, the blocking path to citizenship. All of these, let's say, anti-migration or border-making policies, the wall, the ban, visa laws, they're all about making America white and trying to keep all the non-white out of the border. So as I was listening to your presentations, somehow juxtaposing South Asia and Latin Americas, I was also thinking how to construct solidarity between those that are kept out of the border, the border of whiteness. And then, I don't know, this is an observation, but I was also wondering if the project of radical hospitality is also a project of abolishing the borders, you know, if abolishing human bans and borders, if you see radical hospitality and border abolishment as similar projects or not. Yeah. But thank you very much. This is maybe more of an observation than a question.
That's a brilliant observation. I really appreciate making the Muslim connection there. I think it's really important. And the way all of our papers worked together, thinking about the US-Mexico border, and yeah, I was so grateful to be here and to hear these comments. I mean, there are some problems with the concept of radical hospitality that I didn't really have time to get into. I mean, the usage of the term foreigners and immigrants. As someone who works in Chicana studies, I feel a little uncomfortable with some of what Derrida uses, but I think it is a kind of utopian project that I want to bring into Chicano studies. I don't know if other people have comments or thoughts.
Okay, then may I?
Yeah, but thank you.
Hello. So these were absolutely wonderful presentations and so intense. I feel like I've circumscribed the entire world, and that causes me a little bit of concern and discomfort actually. Please be indulgent. I'm an artist, and I always think about, well, I think discontent is something which one has to do dutifully. So I just feel sometimes, because I think, no, honestly, this is deeply the socio-political, not even underpinnings, overpinnings, and the anthropological underpinnings or overpinnings. All of this, there's so much to think, there's so much to process, and in all of this, I worry a little bit if the image or the art making becomes indexical, and I'm not saying anything new, these are often concerns artists feel and others feel, and then these are, and so maybe what I'm trying to get at is, I'm wondering if whether the form of the meetings can be, this is fantastic, but if it can be reshaped further in a way that one has the possibility of absorbing all of this and processing it, but at the same time, the images somehow escapes from becoming indexical to all the other thoughts and ideas.
Hi. Thanks very much, everybody, for those wonderful papers that are really terribly moving in a terrible way, often. What struck me throughout is the sense that the work of the artist that you all described is a kind of work that only visual artists can do. It's a kind of work on the imagery that exists, the imagery, the visual images that have been inherited, and the visual images that are threatened, and the press of other images from elsewhere and from the colonizers and elsewhere that are also there. And what I noticed, particularly as the papers progressed, was an art historical technique of revisiting a set of images, a limited set, and then adding, re-interrogating them or rethinking about them or re-engaging with them through other images. You accumulated art historical comparisons and the images became richer and richer. And so when we come to hospitality as a utopian project, Derrida did not mean utopia as a unified world which we'd all share in the same way. He absolutely meant the opposite of that. As you know, Charlene, he meant the implication of us all in a kind of hospitality that we can never do totally or completely, but we absolutely have to do, an impossible hospitality. And so I'm connecting that back to the kind of rhythm of each of the papers that I'm just asking you to make a comment on this when I finish in 1 second, if you agree or not, don't agree. Not just about the children who are dead, but because they represent other children who have died before, and they represent children who will die, the ones who will die in the flow of circumstances. My final point is that we used to do art history in relation to the development of the imagery of nations or big civilizations. In other words, in terms of coherences and ultimate structures. But now we must, as you make clear, do art history in terms of the flow of peoples and the transitionality of nations and the erosion of nations, even as people running those nations insist that they must control their populations much more. So that's the sort of dynamic. Anyway, it's a reflection. If you have any comments, I'd be grateful to hear them.
So, yeah, it's an interesting tension. You're right. Derrida's emphasis is on process, right? Is on the continued attempt to enact hospitality. When I was working on the visuals, I kept thinking about, like, well, what would a traditional art historian do? And that person would find sources. So I was trying to find resonances, but not sources. So, and I'm trying to think about how to decolonize the discussion of sources and art history. So it's in a very early stage for me at this point, thinking through that, how we decolonize those art historical tools, if we can. I mean, maybe we should just tear down art history. I'd be happy with that too. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Sangjan. I would like to have a question to you, Sonal. I was interested in listening to your presentation about the northeast of India, in particular Nagaland. I think this session is mostly about the art in the age of migration. If I may add another maybe layer of complexity to that, maybe what are your thoughts about if that would be even further added to the topic of identity? A reason being I'm curious about that is, as far as I'm concerned, I think the far northeastern part of India is characterized because of its geographical location to be distinctively different from other parts of India. Of course, India, you talk about the vast country of, I think, 50 different languages and states. But I think, to what I know in particular, even though there's not much of coverage, but if it's covering, then it's always covering that the northeast of India is distinctively different. So I think, irrespective of its location close to, I think, a lot of potential migrative conflict locations surrounding the area, looking just at the part of India itself is itself quite interesting to explore from a perspective of identity. Just maybe interesting though, because I'm originally from South Korea. So in Korea we have that knowledge that in Nagaland, for instance, there is a distinctive interest into K culture and Korean itself. So I think that also reflects somehow that the people of Nagaland or far northeast India itself do see themselves a bit more closer to the Far Eastern culture. Thank you.
The distinctiveness of northeastern India is has been historically produced by British colonial processes, by cartographies that some of you have mentioned. But it is also a category that Parismita Singh, one of the artists that I discussed today, has said it's a category that she inhabits and resists. So it's a category that's been given in many ways, an administrative and military legacy that continues to the present day, but that has been appropriated by artists. Zubeni Lotha herself, in an interview with me, has said that the British made us as Naga, and that in some sense that's a construction that she seeks to deconstruct in the work that she's doing. So I think all of these artists would understand the Northeast both as material effect, something that has a very real impact on their lives, but also as a set of ideas and identities that are in process and can be acted upon through art, through culture, through civil society. So I think that might be the answer to some of your questions on the Northeast. I have not yet. I lived in Arunachal Pradesh between 1979 and 1981, and I've done some research in Assam. I've gone back to Meghalaya, and, or rather I should say, I did research in Meghalaya and in Arunachal Pradesh this past summer. And this is the beginning of a new project. So my goal is eventually to get to all of the 8 states now that constitute India's Northeast, but I think you also know that there's a remoteness that's been produced, so that to get between these states, from these states to each other is very difficult, even as people make these journeys every day. It's kind of amazing that people are traveling across these boundaries, and at the same time, for someone like me, and maybe others as well, it's actually easier. Elites in northeastern India will say it's easier to fly back to Delhi from Guwahati to get to, say, Dimapur or Imphal or Coimbatore. There's many more flights. And that's how that entire region has been produced. I wanted to say one other thing because I've been thinking about it with Esra's question and how I would answer it. Because the question about comparative migrations, comparative borderlands, I think is essential. And some of the anthropologists who are working on this material, like Malini Sur, have already made comparisons to the work around the US-Mexico border and even Israel and Palestine, and thinking about the India-Bangladesh fence and so on. For myself, I can say right now, given the kinds of artistic projects I'm thinking about, and you saw some of it already in this presentation, I can't even wrap my head around how the India-Pakistan border, let's say at Wagah Atari, is so different, or Rajasthan into Pakistan is so different than the India-Bangladesh border, is so different than the India-Myanmar border, is so different than the India-China border around Arunachal Pradesh. And these are all disputed in some ways, and people are making crossings, but that I feel like at this point, I would even need to kind of do comparative borderland studies within South Asia to understand how we might then make the move to thinking about partitions, migrations, and borderlands elsewhere. But I think absolutely that is the invitation, to think about these processes on a global scale. My own path has been to kind of work my way up from local to regional to national, and then to some kind of international scale.
Thank you. Thanks for this really very diverse also presentations of migrations, forced migration, traditional ways of life, living across lands, not living on fixed locations. But can you say a little bit about the systemic, continued violence that is embedded in migration? I mean, Sonal, you showed also Sarina Bimshi when we produced with her Blue, Out of Blue. She spoke about like being an Indian in Africa, and Mahmoud Mamdani wrote a lot about this, and then having to leave again very rapidly under Idi Amin, and then we see it, Heather, you spoke about also the Sapnis, they had to choose, the Norwegian Sapnis had to choose a passport at one time. They had to decide which nation they want to belong to, but they would always go across. And so this continued violence and a migration that kind of never ends, and a continued dislocation. I think, can you say a bit about that? Because that is something, if we say thinking historically in the present, because it doesn't stop. Or if we look up Rwanda, we worked a lot also way back, also with Okwi, on what happened there, and the conflicts that are inscribed by the post-colonial, by the nation states that came out of a post-colonial constellation and condition, and create a lot of the violence that we see today.
I'm happy for others to address this. I feel like I have less to say because these comments have been so rich and given me much to work with. I think you're absolutely right in all the observations that you've made, Uta, Terri, those of you that I don't know in the audience. I think that the BMG work points to, you saw what I was doing, juxtaposing works that are quite well known, I think, to this audience with works that are less known, to say that I think some of the logics are similar. The media may be different, some of the issues are related. There is a gesture towards comparative work thinking about migration from global south to north, which the BMG work to some extent encapsulates, but certainly the writing of Viet Thanh Nguyen and Ocean Vuong. And the thread here is that there is a recursivity. So it's not like there's migration from global south to north, or anywhere, frankly, south-south migration that has an end. And that these are processes that are unfolding, even if, let's say, migrants eventually settle in the global north. My interest, of course, has been in migration in the global south, and those were the examples I wanted to highlight, because I do think that south to north migration gets the vast majority of attention. When you saw the numbers, these are UNHCR and other numbers which are grossly underestimated. I mean, official statistics are underestimating where displaced persons are in the world and how they're being hosted and so on. I think, I'm trying to think about the violence that's ongoing. Here's also, I think, a point that that the PMG work, but other work as well, illustrates, is that the artists are actually making journeys and returns. I mean, you know her later work, that Out of Blue was her first return in some ways that she imagined, but she's made many more works moving between India, Africa, and Europe. And I think that shot, or that sequence at the end with the at the airstrip is prescient in some ways. It sort of forecasts the artist's career over the next 20 years in terms of enacting patterns of migration that I think we can see in other work. And here's what I will say that I think connects it to much of the work that I wrote about. I'm not sure that I would have used the word hope, but I'm interested in that coming up. I think resilience, resistance is work that the artists use themselves, by contrast to presenting the Global South as a scene of death and disaster, as you often see in news media. And Razor, of course, has written about Afro-pessimism in photography, in kind of mainstream photography, in a different register than the way that we use the word these days. So it's against those conventional images of the South as scenes of death, disaster, devastation, which have only in some ways been compounded by a lot of the literature and scholarship on climate change, which presents scenes of crisis and catastrophe. And yes, there's recognition. None of these works that I focused on today is naive about the effects of violence. And it's many kinds of violence. It's not that you can isolate environmental violence from state violence, from domestic violence, for example, that these are all connected. And I think that is a feminist claim that has perhaps been underestimated in thinking about ecology, environment, migration, and their relationship to each other.
Thank you. And my answer doesn't have very much to do with that in the same way, because the situation in the Arctic has been so different. But, you know, we, of course, traveled across, we're one people from Russia, Siberia today, all the way through to Greenland. And yet the violence done by the borders that have crossed us over time has been immense to the point where it's very, very hard to work together and to build any kind of collaboration amongst one people. And if it was our land still, in the nation state kind of a sense, it would probably be one of the vastest indigenous territories on the planet to be shared by one person, by one people. And so you think about the power that we would have had to have the Arctic, our land that we've been in for thousands of years, but that modern day nation states have disenfranchised us of, is huge. Even within Canada, we are sort of chopped into 4 pieces, and it's been very hard because of the different ways that territorial and provincial laws, for example, impact arts funding for artists, has made it very difficult for artists to collaborate within the country or even to get together. And of course, the very high cost of travel. You know, a flight from Ottawa, which is the capital, to Igloliorte, which is the capital of Nunavut, is only about 2 hours. You know, if I took a flight from Ottawa to Halifax, which is also about 2 hours, but this way, that would be, you know, $500 or $600. And if you fly from Ottawa to Igloliorte, that's $3,000 or $2,000. And so, you know, there are places and that's the big center. And then if you want to go to Pond Inlet, that's at one point, that was the most expensive place in the world to go, and it's, you know, 3 hours flying from the capital. And so all of that really disenfranchises and impoverishes peoples who live in the north and who can't move. The settlement of the Arctic, in fact, is a great history of violence, because during the Cold War and even before that, the assertion of Canada as a nation state that included the Arctic archipelago. To do that, the Canadian government took Inuit from where they were traveling and moved them to little communities and settlements. And the phrase that's often used in Canada is as human flagpoles, to indicate that there were Canadians in these places throughout the Arctic, and those people suffered greatly in that process. Another thing is, like, our dog teams. Every family had a team of 8 or 9 dogs that they relied on to travel, to hunt, to go out, to be free, and to feed your family and so on. And in the 1950s and 60s, so pretty recent history, there was a government-led wholesale dog slaughter that led to the mass killing by our CMP officers of dogs throughout the north in order to make people settle into communities. So that history of our sort of ending of our migration has been hugely violent, absolutely. Thank you for your question.
Hi, Raul Hinojosa. I'm from occupied Mexico, California. Spent a lot of time here in Dubai in South Asia. I came here, I'm a totally outsider. I'm not an art historian by any means. I'm a political economist, so I hope you don't mind this trespassing. But I came here for trying to understand if the challenge of being in Sharjah, by the way, which is the site where in a few months there will be the Global Climate Conference, which will be in Dubai, and the connections that we can make to that activity, because it's of fundamental importance, and I invite really everybody in this conversation to be a part of this ongoing global conversation, which needs this vision. I would say it's an issue of hope, yes, what I picked up from this conference, but, and the part of it is the deconstructing of the violence and the coloniality. But really the question that I think everybody points to, but we need to really focus on more, is what happens after decoloniality? What happens after hope? Where do we have the vision from the artists, as you all say, that we need to have, that articulates these new perspective of how, and urgently we need to know how do we survive? And that is a message that again, I think the United Nations has done a tremendous job in the last 28 years in terms of putting the issue of the urgency on the table and directions of where it has to go. But how does that translate into people's emotional way of living the rest of their lives right now? And I think that that's the potential role of your artists that you're looking at. And I'm just curious if you could think about where is that going? I mean, because I think I almost get very frustrated, excited, and frustrated at the same time from this conversation that yes, there is hope, right? But where is this hope leading us? Where does the artists, your vision of where some of the artists are taking us, and how quickly can we move there? Because it's urgent.
Nowhere, actually. So just a few years ago, we were planning a project with Indian artists, Bangladeshi, Nepali, and Pakistani. Then after a few months of talking, we could not decide what to do, because Pakistanis are not getting any visa for India. Indians cannot go to Pakistan. As a Bangladeshi artist, if I go to Pakistan once, then I'm not getting visa for India or America. Then we ended up going to Nepal. So that was our no man's land in some way. Nepali artists didn't have to get any visa. Indian artists. Without visa, they can go to Nepal. Pakistani artists and us, we had to take visa. But interestingly, the Pakistani artists, they didn't have any connected flight, direct flight to Nepal. So what they did, they had to come to Dubai. They had to transit in Dubai and then going back to Nepal. So that's how we end up. What can you do? This is the reality.
Thank you for that amazing question. I think given the topic of the panel and the conference, I mean, I was certainly focused on the past and how colonial violence in the past structures the world today and how artists respond to that. But you made me think there's a whole group of other artists who are looking to the future, who are more focused on envisioning a more just future, and artists who are working in the realm of decolonial love, I would say, too, and thinking of, like, I don't know, Beatriz Cortez, Central American artist, or other folks. I think there are probably other, but what an amazing theme for a panel or something to, artists envisioning a more just decolonized future. Thank you.
We are out of time. Thank you very much.